It was a warm afternoon, and the streets of the small town were quiet, almost peaceful. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a golden glow on the houses and sidewalks. People were finishing their work, children were playing in yards, and the occasional car passed by without much notice. Among the few drivers on the road was a man who had spent the whole day in the courthouse. He was a judge, known around the town for being fair, calm, and respected by nearly everyone. His day had been long, filled with difficult decisions and cases that tested his patience. Now, he was simply looking forward to getting home. Sitting quietly in his car and leaving the weight of the courtroom behind him, he drove slowly. Following the familiar route he had taken countless times before, the town had a rhythm he knew well, each stoplight and turn memorized. He noticed the light changing ahead and eased his car to a stop, waiting patiently as the cross-traffic passed. The calm of the afternoon seemed almost soothing, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe. Thinking about the quiet evening he would have at home, his mind drifted to simple things: what he might eat for dinner, the book he had been meaning to finish, the comfortable chair in his living room where he could finally relax. Suddenly, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. He blinked in surprise, pulling his car safely to the side of the road. A feeling of unease washed over him. He had been pulled over many times in his life, usually for minor traffic violations, and he always complied without argument. But something about the officer's tone, which he could hear even before seeing the man, felt tense. The officer approached quickly, his steps heavy and purposeful. The judge rolled down his window slowly, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. The officer didn't waste time with pleasantries. He immediately started asking questions, his voice sharp and demanding. The judge, taken aback by the sudden aggression, tried to respond politely. He explained calmly that he had just come from court, that he was a judge, and that he had done nothing wrong. But the officer didn't pause. He interrupted, speaking over him, clearly unwilling to hear more. There was a harshness in his tone that went beyond a simple traffic stop. It was as if he had already decided the man was guilty of something. Even without knowing any details, the judge remained calm. He had faced many tense situations in the courtroom, dealing with angry defendants, upset lawyers, and emotional families. Staying composed under pressure was part of his role, and he relied on that same skill now. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, hoping to de-escalate the situation. He mentioned his identification in the courthouse, trying to assure the officer that he was a law-abiding citizen. But the officer was not listening. The tension in the air grew, the quiet afternoon fading into an uncomfortable standoff. The officer's body language became more aggressive. He leaned closer to the car, his face tight with anger. His eyes were narrowed, scanning the judge as if trying to find some flaw, some reason to justify his behavior. The judge, feeling the weight of the man's suspicion, stayed silent for a moment, giving him space to speak. He didn't want to provoke a situation that could spiral out of control. But the officer seemed impatient, frustrated that the man wasn't responding in the way he expected. Without warning, the officer made a rash decision. He slapped the judge across the face, a sharp, quick movement that sent a jolt of shock through him. The judge's hand flew to his cheek instinctively, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. He had never experienced such an act of aggression without cause, and he struggled to process it. Yet, despite the pain and shock, he remained composed. He knew that reacting with anger or retaliation could make the situation far worse. People, walking nearby, began to notice the commotion. Some paused to watch, sensing that something serious was unfolding. A woman walking her dog slowed, her eyes wide as she observed the scene. She could see the officer standing over the driver, his posture rigid and tense, and the driver holding his cheek, still seated in the car. She instinctively pulled out her phone, ready to record what was happening. A sense of disbelief hung in the air. The town was small, and everyone knew each other to some degree. Seeing such aggression in the middle of a quiet street was unusual and alarming. The judge, although stunned, tried to speak. His voice was calm, measured, and steady, even as the sting of the slap lingered. He explained again that he was a judge, that he had been working all day, and that there had been no reason for the officer to act this way. The officer, however, seemed determined to continue, as if his initial action had emboldened him. He gestured sharply, his tone growing louder, and repeated accusations that had no basis. The crowd of onlookers began to murmur among themselves. Sensing that the officer's behavior was inappropriate, one person whispered to another, pointing at the man in the car, suggesting that he looked familiar, like someone they had seen on the news or in local reports. This recognition didn't reach the officer, who was still focused on asserting his authority. Another bystander, feeling uneasy, picked up their phone and dialed the non-emergency police line, quietly reporting that the officer seemed to be overreacting. They described the situation as tense, with one man holding up his hand after being struck without cause. The judge remained calm, waiting for someone with reason to intervene. The officer's frustration grew as he continued to misjudge the situation. He demanded identification more forcefully and stepped closer to the car. Ignoring the fact that the driver's hands were already visible, the judge slowly reached for his wallet, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening to show his identification. But the officer reacted quickly, his hand on his holster, warning him not to move. The judge's heart beat faster, but he did not panic. He had faced pressure and conflict many times in his career and knew that staying composed was his best chance of resolving the incident safely. The woman recording the situation kept her camera steady, making sure to capture the interaction. Her presence added another layer of accountability, though the officer didn't seem aware of it. The people around began to gather slightly closer, some whispering to one another, some simply watching silently. The atmosphere became heavy with tension, the kind of weight that makes even simple movements feel significant. The judge's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the officer's aggression, and it became clear to the onlookers that something was very wrong. As the minutes passed, the judge continued to speak gently, repeating that he had done nothing wrong and that he hoped the situation could be resolved peacefully. He mentioned the courthouse again, the authority of his position, and the fact that he was simply driving home after a long day. Yet the officer seemed unwilling to hear any explanation. The slap, the aggressive stance, and the sharp tone had already set a tone of conflict that the officer was struggling to reverse. The tension was thick, almost tangible. The judge felt the eyes of the bystanders on him, their concern and curiosity mixing with the strange disbelief that someone in uniform could act this way. He kept his voice steady, careful not to raise it, careful not to provoke. Every word was measured, every movement deliberate. He reminded himself that losing control would not help him, that the goal was to de-escalate and survive the encounter with dignity intact. The officer's impatience began to show cracks. Small gestures, slight shifts in stance, the tightening of his jaw signs that he was aware he might be losing control, but unwilling to admit it. The judge, sensing the subtle changes, continued to maintain his calm, speaking in a way that was both firm and non-threatening. He knew that remaining composed might be the only way to prevent the situation from turning dangerous. The bystanders continued to murmur, some whispering to each other, some holding up their phones to capture the unfolding scene, all feeling the weight of the moment. Even as his cheek throbbed from the slap, the judge refused to let anger take over. He took slow, measured breaths, focusing on the reality of the situation. He knew that reacting impulsively could escalate things further. The officer, on the other hand, seemed trapped in a cycle of aggression, unable to back down without feeling he had lost authority. The gap between the two men widened, not in physical space, but in tension and mindset. One remained composed, the other consumed by bias and impulse. The sun continued to dip, casting long shadows on the street. The small town, usually quiet and safe, now bore witness to an unusual scene of conflict and tension. The judge stayed seated, hands visible, speaking calmly, refusing to escalate. The officer paced slightly, gesturing angrily, clearly frustrated by the judge's refusal to react in fear or anger. The bystanders watched, some shaking their heads, some speaking softly to each other, all aware that something significant was unfolding before them. The judge's composure and the officer's rash actions created a scene that would soon be remembered. A moment where bias clashed with dignity on a quiet street in a small town. The situation on the street was tense. The judge remained in his car, hands visible on the steering wheel, his cheek still stinging from the slap. He tried to maintain calm, but the weight of the incident pressed on him. The officer continued to shout, his face tight with anger, making accusations without any real cause. Around them, a small group of bystanders began to gather, sensing that something serious was happening. Some stopped walking, unsure if they should intervene or just watch. Others reached for their phones, ready to capture whatever unfolded next. A woman walking her dog was one of the first to notice how out of control the officer had become. She pulled out her phone cautiously, recording from a safe distance. She had no idea who the man in the car was, only that he had been hit for no reason and that something didn't feel right. The officer, caught up in his own assumptions, didn't see her, focused entirely on asserting authority over the man in front of him. Every word he spoke was sharp and demanding, and the tension in the air grew heavier by the second. The judge took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. He had seen anger and conflict in many forms in the courtroom, and he understood that reacting impulsively would only worsen the situation. He spoke again, his voice calm and steady, explaining once more that he had been working all day at the courthouse and had done nothing wrong. He mentioned that he was a judge, hoping that reason might reach the officer. But the officer seemed deaf to the facts. His bias had taken over, and he refused to listen. People in the area began to murmur to each other, exchanging worried glances. One bystander whispered to a friend, noting that the man in the car looked familiar, like someone they had seen in the news or local papers. Others held their phones up, ready to record in case the situation escalated further. The presence of the crowd seemed to make the officer more defensive, yet he did not calm down. Instead, he stepped closer to the car, leaning in aggressively. Ignoring the fact that the man's hands were already clearly visible, the judge reached slowly for his wallet, showing no sudden movements, intending to provide his identification. He kept his voice low, careful not to anger the officer further. He hoped that once the officer saw his identification, he would realize the mistake and step back. But the officer, still frustrated and biased, placed a hand near his holster, warning the judge not to move too quickly. The judge's heart pounded, but he reminded himself to remain calm. Understanding that patience and composure were his best tools in the moment, the woman recording continued to focus her phone, capturing the officer's harsh behavior and the judge's calm responses. A few other bystanders joined her, some holding up their phones as well. The murmurs grew, and a sense of tension spread among those watching. People exchanged worried looks, clearly disturbed by the aggression they were witnessing. The judge remained seated, his breathing steady, refusing to react in fear or anger, despite the discomfort and shock he felt from the slap. As the minutes passed, more people began to gather. Some came from nearby houses, curious about the commotion. Others slowed down on the street, observing from a distance. The presence of the growing crowd seemed to make the officer more agitated. He continued to shout, his tone sharp and accusing, yet the judge's calm demeanor remained unchanged. The contrast between the two men became more noticeable. Highlighting the irrationality of the officer's behavior, the judge tried again to speak, explaining in a calm voice that he was a judge and that there had been no reason for the officer's aggression. He mentioned the courthouse, trying to appeal to reason and authority. But the officer ignored him, continuing to act on his assumptions and bias. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and someone whispered that the man in the car could be someone important, someone they should recognize. This speculation did not reach the officer, who seemed trapped in his own perspective. A bystander, feeling uneasy about the situation, called the non-emergency police line. They explained what was happening, noting that the officer seemed to be overreacting and that the man in the car had been struck without reason. They provided a description of the location and the people involved, hoping that help would arrive before the situation escalated further. Meanwhile, the judge remained calm, speaking gently, asking the officer to step back and consider the facts. He emphasized that no one needed to get hurt and that the situation could be solved peacefully. The officer's frustration began to show in subtle ways. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened, and his gestures became sharper. He seemed aware that he was losing control, but refused to admit it. The judge, sensing this, continued to maintain his composure, speaking with patience and care. He knew that staying calm was the only way to prevent the encounter from turning dangerous. The crowd watched closely, some whispering to each other, some holding up their phones, all aware that something unusual and serious was unfolding. Despite the discomfort and pain from the slap, the judge refused to let anger take over. He focused on the reality of the situation, taking slow, steady breaths. He understood that losing control would only make things worse. The officer, on the other hand, seemed trapped in a cycle of aggression, unable to back down without feeling that he had lost authority. The tension between them created a heavy, almost tangible feeling in the air. The judge's calmness contrasted sharply with the officer's rash behavior, making the situation feel even more surreal to the bystanders. The sun continued to set, casting long shadows across the street. The small town, usually quiet and safe, had become the scene of a tense confrontation. The judge remained seated, hands visible, speaking gently and steadily, refusing to escalate the situation. The officer paced slightly, gesturing angrily, clearly frustrated by the judge's refusal to react with fear or anger. The bystanders watched silently, some shaking their heads, some speaking softly to each other, all feeling the gravity of what was happening in the crowd. A few people began to recognize the man in the car. They whispered to each other, realizing that he was someone important in the town, someone whose actions and decisions had shaped many lives. Their recognition added a new layer of tension to the scene, but also hope that the situation could be resolved without further harm. The judge remained composed, aware that any sudden move or loud reaction could escalate the conflict. He continued to speak calmly, reminding the officer that reason and fairness could guide the situation if he allowed it. As time passed, the tension remained high, but the judge's calm demeanor seemed to influence some of the bystanders. They whispered to each other, noting the stark contrast between the two men. The officer's aggression was clear, but the judge's patience and composure stood out even more. People began to realize that this was not a simple traffic stop gone wrong, but a situation fueled by bias and rash decisions. The judge's restraint made them respect him even more, and they silently hoped that help would arrive soon. The woman recording the event continued to hold her phone steady, capturing every moment. She could see the officer's frustration growing, tension in his movements, and the way he ignored the facts presented to him. The judge's calm responses were equally visible, a model of composure and patience. The contrast between them became a powerful image, one that would later be shared and remembered by many. The bystanders' murmurs grew louder, some expressing concern, others offering quiet words of support to the judge. Though from a safe distance, the judge, still seated, remained focused on staying calm. He spoke gently to the officer, repeating that he had done nothing wrong and asking him to reconsider his actions. He emphasized that no one needed to get hurt and that the situation could be resolved peacefully. The officer, however, seemed unwilling to listen, his bias and frustration clouding his judgment. The crowd's whispers and phone recordings seemed to have little immediate effect, but the presence of witnesses added pressure that could not be ignored. Minutes passed, each feeling longer than the last. The judge's patience never wavered. He continued to speak calmly, refusing to escalate, refusing to react in fear or anger. The officer's body language showed tension and frustration, small gestures revealing that he might be aware of the gravity of his actions, even if he refused to admit it. The bystanders watched closely, some whispering to each other, some holding their phones, all aware that they were witnessing something significant. A clash between bias and dignity in the middle of a quiet town street. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew longer, painting the street in shades of orange and gold. The small town, usually peaceful, had become a scene of tension and unease. The judge remained calm, speaking gently, hands visible, refusing to escalate. The officer continued to pace, gesturing sharply, clearly frustrated by the judge's composure. The bystanders watched silently, some shaking their heads, some whispering softly, all feeling the weight of what was happening. The judge's patience, composure, and dignity stood out as a contrast to the officer's rash and biased behavior. setting the stage for what would come next in this unexpected and tense confrontation. The tension on the street was growing heavier with every passing minute. The judge stayed in his car, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, his cheeks still sore from the slap. He continued to speak calmly, trying to reason with the officer, explaining again that he had just finished a long day in court and had done nothing wrong. The officer, however, remained aggressive, pacing and gesturing sharply, unwilling to hear any explanation. The small group of bystanders had grown slightly larger, some whispering to each other, some holding up their phones, capturing every movement. Suddenly, the distant sound of sirens reached the street. 2 patrol cars turned the corner and approached the scene quickly. The judge's heart beat a little faster, a mix of relief and anxiety running through him. The higher-ranking supervisor stepped out of one of the patrol cars, her face calm but serious. She looked directly at the officer, asking what was happening. The officer, still trying to assert authority, immediately began to explain, framing the situation as if he had stopped a dangerous individual. His words were quick, defensive, and slightly chaotic. The supervisor listened quietly, her eyes shifting toward the man in the car. The judge remained calm, silent for a moment, letting the situation unfold under her supervision. She noticed the officer's aggressive tone and body language, and something about the man in the car caught her attention. She asked the judge to show his identification. The judge reached slowly for his wallet, keeping all movements deliberate and non-threatening. The officer grew impatient, interrupting. But the supervisor's presence seemed to bring some pause as the judge handed over his ID. The supervisor's expression changed. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took a step back, realizing immediately who she was looking at. The judge was a senior figure in the community, someone whose rulings had shaped the county and whose reputation was widely respected. She turned to the officer, her face now stern, the previous patience replaced by shock and disapproval. The officer's arrogance and confidence faltered for the first time as he realized the mistake he had made. The bystanders, sensing the shift in the air, whispered among themselves, their curiosity turning into astonishment. The supervisor spoke firmly, asking the officer to step back and remain calm. She gestured for him to hand over his weapon temporarily and reminded him that the situation had escalated due to his rash behavior. The officer hesitated, the reality of his actions sinking in. The supervisor then turned to the judge, offering a quiet but sincere apology, acknowledging the officer's misconduct and the undue stress the judge had endured. The judge nodded slightly, acknowledging her words, but maintaining his calm composure. He wanted the focus to remain on the incident itself, rather than on him personally. The bystanders, now fully aware of the judge's identity, began to whisper more openly. Some expressed concern for the judge, while others murmured about how the officer could have acted so recklessly. The woman recording the scene continued to hold her phone steady, capturing every word and gesture. The supervisor asked to see the footage, and the woman handed over her phone. The supervisor watched carefully, her expression darkening as she saw the officer's unprovoked aggression and how he had ignored all attempts at communication. Meanwhile, the officer began to sweat, realizing that this incident could end his career. He stood silently for a moment, caught between panic and shame. The supervisor calmly explained that an investigation would be launched immediately and that he would face serious consequences. The judge, though still in shock from the earlier slap, spoke gently, reminding everyone to remain calm and to handle the situation peacefully. He emphasized that fairness and respect should guide every action, even in moments of conflict. The crowd of bystanders, now fully engaged in the unfolding drama, watched silently. Some whispered to each other about the officer's mistake, while others expressed admiration for the judge's composure. The supervisor continued to manage the situation, making sure the officer remained in place and that no further escalation occurred. She instructed another officer to remain nearby to ensure the judge's safety and to control the crowd if necessary. The judge, feeling the tension ease slightly with the supervisor's intervention, allowed himself a small moment to collect his thoughts. He knew that staying composed was important, not just for himself, but for everyone witnessing the event. His calmness seemed to influence the bystanders, who relaxed slightly but remained watchful. The officer, however, still struggled with the reality of what had happened. His confidence had been shaken. He could see that the consequences were unavoidable. The supervisor spoke again, now addressing both the officer and the crowd. She emphasized the importance of accountability and the seriousness of the situation. She acknowledged that mistakes happen, but when bias and rash decisions lead to aggression, the consequences must be clear. The judge listened quietly, nodding occasionally, appreciating her handling of the situation. He spoke briefly, reinforcing her message, and reminded everyone that the goal should be fairness and justice, not escalation or personal conflict. As the supervisor continued to manage the situation, the officer was instructed to step aside and remain quiet while the investigation began. He complied reluctantly. The reality of the incident settling in as the bystanders continued to record and discuss what had occurred. The judge remained in his car, calm but attentive, watching as the officer's behavior was scrutinized. The supervisor ensured that the interaction remained professional, keeping the atmosphere controlled and preventing any further incidents. The woman who had recorded the incident stepped back slightly. Realizing the significance of the footage she had captured, she could see the shock on the officer's face and the respect in the supervisor's demeanor toward the judge. Other bystanders whispered about how rare it was to see someone remain so composed under such aggression. The judge, despite the sting on his cheek, maintained his dignity, speaking gently and encouraging everyone to remain peaceful and respectful. The supervisor then asked the officer to hand over his badge temporarily, explaining that this was standard procedure in cases of misconduct. The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of his actions, hesitated but eventually complied. The crowd murmured, noting the shift in authority and the seriousness of the situation. The judge remained calm, observing the interactions. Knowing that his composure had helped prevent further escalation, minutes passed, and the supervisor spoke again, outlining the steps that would follow. She emphasized that an internal investigation would be launched immediately and that the officer would face disciplinary action. She also reassured the judge that he was safe and that the situation was under control. The judge thanked her quietly, acknowledging her efforts, and continued to speak gently to the crowd, reminding them that fairness and respect were essential in every interaction. The bystanders, now fully aware of the judge's identity, expressed admiration for his calm and dignified behavior. They whispered to each other about how unusual it was to witness such composure in the face of aggression. The woman recording the incident felt a sense of responsibility, knowing that her footage would serve as evidence of the officer's misconduct and the judge's restraint. The atmosphere, while still tense, had shifted from immediate danger to a sense of accountability and resolution. The officer, standing quietly to the side, could no longer deny the severity of his actions. The supervisor's firm yet professional handling of the situation made it clear that there would be consequences. The judge, still in his car, maintained his calm demeanor, speaking occasionally to the crowd, reinforcing the importance of patience and respect. His example influenced the bystanders, who began to settle down, realizing that the situation was under control. As the sun continued to set, casting long shadows across the street, the small town witnessed a powerful moment of accountability and dignity. The judge's calm composure had prevented the situation from escalating, and the supervisor's firm intervention ensured that the officer would face the consequences of his actions. The bystanders, now fully engaged, quietly reflected on what they had seen, recognizing the importance of fairness, patience, and restraint in moments of conflict. The officer, facing the reality of his misconduct, remained silent, his previous arrogance replaced by shame and realization. The judge continued to speak softly, emphasizing that every person should be treated with dignity and that fairness should guide all actions. The supervisor monitored the situation closely, ensuring that the officer complied with the procedures and that the bystanders remained safe. The woman recording the incident captured the entire interaction, knowing that it would serve as an important record of both the officer's behavior and the judge's restraint. The small-town street, once quiet and peaceful, had become the scene of a significant confrontation. Yet through it all, the judge's patience and calmness had set a standard for how to handle conflict with dignity. Now facing immediate consequences, began to understand the gravity of his actions. The supervisor's intervention and the bystanders' presence had created a situation where accountability and fairness could prevail. The judge's quiet strength and composed demeanor had influenced everyone around him, turning a potentially dangerous situation into a moment of respect, reflection, and the beginning of justice being served. The street remained tense, but the immediate danger had begun to ease. The supervisor's presence had brought order, and the bystanders had stepped back slightly, still observing the scene with curiosity and concern.
Officer
who had slapped. The judge stood to the side, his posture stiff, a clear sign that he now understood the gravity of his actions. The judge, still in his car, maintained his calm, his breathing steady, his focus on ensuring that the situation did not escalate further. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him, some filled with concern, some with awe at his composure. The supervisor addressed the officer firmly, reminding him that any further aggression or rash behavior would only worsen his situation. She instructed him to hand over his badge and weapon temporarily, and to remain compliant while the internal investigation began. The officer hesitated for a moment, looking around at the gathering crowd, but eventually obeyed. The weight of reality seemed to finally settle on him, and he appeared smaller, less confident, as the bystanders murmured amongst themselves. The judge, though still recovering from the shock of being struck, spoke softly to the crowd and the officer. He emphasized the importance of staying calm and treating every person with respect, even in moments of conflict. His words, calm and deliberate, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The bystanders, many of whom were recording the entire incident, whispered to each other about how composed the judge was, how he had not allowed fear or anger to dictate his actions. The woman who had recorded the earlier moments approached the supervisor and handed her the phone, explaining that she had captured the officer's behavior from the very beginning. The supervisor watched the footage carefully, her expression growing more serious as she observed the officer's aggression and refusal to listen. The judge sat quietly in his car, allowing the supervisor to review the video, understanding that this would provide clear evidence of what had transpired. Internal Affairs was contacted immediately, and a sense of accountability began to settle over the scene. The supervisor coordinated with another officer to control the crowd and ensure that everyone remained safe. The judge, though still alert, felt a slight relief knowing that the proper authorities were now involved and that the officer would be held responsible. The bystanders continued to murmur softly, expressing both concern and admiration for how the judge had handled himself. The officer, standing to the side, now looked visibly anxious. His hands trembled slightly, and he avoided eye contact with the judge. He understood that his actions had crossed a line, that the slap and the aggression had serious consequences. The supervisor approached him again, speaking firmly but professionally, explaining the next steps in the investigation and the disciplinary process he would face. The officer nodded reluctantly, realizing that there was no escaping the situation he had created. The judge finally stepped out of his car. Still maintaining a calm and composed demeanor, he greeted the supervisor politely and spoke softly to the bystanders, reassuring them that everything was under control. He emphasized that the focus should be on fairness and accountability, not personal revenge or anger. His words were measured and gentle, and the crowd responded with quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. People began to feel a sense of relief, knowing that the situation was being handled appropriately. The supervisor made it clear that the officer would be suspended pending a full review of his conduct. She reassured the judge and the bystanders that the department took the incident seriously and that steps would be taken to prevent similar situations in the future. The judge remained composed, listening carefully, his calm presence influencing the atmosphere. The bystanders, who had initially been tense and concerned, began to relax slightly, sensing that the immediate threat had passed. The officer was escorted to a patrol car, while the supervisor spoke briefly with the judge, apologizing for the officer's actions and acknowledging the undue stress the judge had endured. The judge nodded, accepting the apology, but keeping his focus on the importance of justice and fairness. He spoke gently to the bystanders again, reminding them that every person should be treated with dignity, and that patience and calm could prevent many conflicts from escalating. As the officer was placed in the patrol car, the bystanders continued to discuss what had happened. Some expressed disbelief at how aggressive the officer had been, while others commented on the judge's remarkable composure. The woman who had recorded the incident shared the footage with others, who were amazed at the contrast between the officer's rash behavior and the judge's calm restraint. The supervisor ensured that the officer remained compliant and that no further escalation occurred. The judge, while standing outside his car, took a moment to collect himself. He had endured a shocking and aggressive act, yet he remained composed, determined to focus on fairness and justice rather than anger or retaliation. His calmness influenced the crowd, who began to realize the importance of handling conflicts with dignity. The supervisor coordinated with additional officers to manage the scene and ensure everyone's safety, while the bystanders quietly observed, reflecting on the events they had just witnessed. The woman with the phone continued to hold it steady, capturing every moment of the officer's accountability and the judge's composed presence. Knew that the footage would serve as an important record of the incident, both for the investigation and for the public's understanding of what had transpired. The bystanders whispered to each other, discussing the lessons they could take from the situation, particularly the judge's ability to remain calm and respectful under extreme provocation. The officer, now fully aware of the seriousness of his actions, remained silent in the patrol car, his previous confidence replaced by shame and anxiety. The supervisor continued to manage the scene professionally, ensuring that all necessary steps were being taken to hold the officer accountable. The judge remained composed, speaking softly to the crowd, reminding them that fairness and respect should guide all interactions, even in moments of conflict. His words carried weight and authority, reinforcing the importance of handling disputes calmly and responsibly. The bystanders, now fully engaged, began to reflect on the events. They admired the judge's composure and patience, recognizing the courage it took to remain calm in the face of aggression. Some whispered to each other about how rare it was to witness such dignity and restraint. The woman recording the incident continued to capture everything, knowing that the footage would be valuable for understanding the sequence of events and the importance of accountability. The street, once tense and chaotic, began to settle into a quieter atmosphere. The judge's calm demeanor, combined with the supervisor's professional handling of the officer, created a sense of order and resolution. The bystanders, though, still talking softly among themselves, began to feel a sense of relief. Realizing that the situation had been handled appropriately, the officer, facing the reality of his misconduct, remained in the patrol car, aware that his actions had serious consequences. As the evening approached, the judge spoke one last time to the bystanders. He reminded them that patience, respect, and fairness were essential in every interaction. He emphasized that anger and rash decisions could escalate conflicts unnecessarily, and that remaining composed could prevent harm and promote understanding. The crowd listened attentively, absorbing the lessons from the incident and the judge's calm, measured words. The supervisor ensured that all procedures were followed, documenting the officer's misconduct and preparing for the internal review. She thanked the bystanders for their cooperation and reminded them that accountability and fairness were key components of a just community. The judge nodded in agreement, appreciating her professional approach and commitment to resolving the situation appropriately. The officer, now fully aware of the consequences he faced, sat quietly in the patrol car. His actions had been recorded, witnessed by multiple people, and would be thoroughly reviewed. The judge, despite the shock and pain of the earlier slap, remained composed and dignified, focusing on the importance of fairness, respect, and accountability. The bystanders, having witnessed the entire event, quietly reflected on the lessons they could take from the situation. The street, once a place of tension and conflict, had transformed into a scene of accountability and reflection. The judge's calm composure, the supervisor's professional handling, and the bystanders' respectful observation had ensured that the situation was resolved without further escalation. The officer faced the reality of his misconduct, the consequences clear and unavoidable. The judge, standing quietly and composed, had demonstrated the power of patience, respect, and dignity in the face of aggression, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed the event. After the immediate tension had eased, the judge remained on the street, his calm presence grounding the scene. He had endured aggression, bias, and an unexpected confrontation, yet he maintained a composed and dignified demeanor.
They're the bystanders
Who had observed the events unfold, whispered to each other, sharing their astonishment at how he had managed the situation without anger or fear. The woman who had recorded the earlier incidents remained nearby, quietly reviewing the footage on her phone and realizing its importance as evidence. The officer who had slapped the judge sat quietly in a patrol car, his demeanor subdued and reflective. His previous confidence had been replaced by a mix of shame and fear. He now understood the severity of his actions and the likely consequences he would face. The supervisor remained nearby, overseeing the situation carefully, ensuring that procedures were followed and that no further escalation could occur. She spoke with other officers, coordinating the next steps and documenting the incident thoroughly for the internal investigation. The judge finally began to speak again, addressing the bystanders softly but firmly. He emphasized that every person deserved to be treated with respect and that anger or rash decisions could lead to unnecessary harm. His words were calm and measured, carrying a weight that captured everyone's attention. He reminded them that accountability and fairness were essential in all interactions, whether in everyday life or positions of authority. The bystanders nodded silently, absorbing the lesson he imparted through both his words and his actions. A few residents who had recognized the judge approached cautiously, expressing concern and admiration. They thanked him for his composure, noting how difficult it must have been to remain calm under such provocation. The judge acknowledged their words with a small nod and gentle smile, but his focus remained on ensuring that the situation concluded peacefully. He encouraged the crowd to remain calm, not to speculate, and to let the authorities handle the investigation. The supervisor approached the judge, offering a formal apology once again for the officer's behavior and explaining the steps being taken to hold him accountable. She assured him that the incident would be thoroughly reviewed and that appropriate disciplinary actions would follow. The judge accepted the apology graciously, understanding that the focus should remain on fairness and accountability rather than personal feelings. He spoke briefly to the supervisor about ensuring that the public understood the seriousness of the situation and the importance of preventing similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, the officer was escorted from the patrol car and led toward a temporary holding area while the internal review began. He moved slowly, his confidence diminished, clearly aware that his actions had crossed a line that could not be undone. The bystanders, now fully aware of the officer's misconduct, watched silently, some whispering among themselves, some recording discreetly. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to a quiet sense of accountability. As everyone recognized that the situation was being handled with the seriousness it deserved, the judge took a few steps down the street, his movements deliberate and composed. He spoke to the crowd again, emphasizing the importance of calm and respectful behavior in all situations. He reminded them that conflicts could often be avoided through patience, communication, and understanding. The crowd listened intently, appreciating the calm authority in his words and the strength of his example. Many began to reflect on how they might handle difficult situations in their own lives, inspired by the judge's restraint. The supervisor coordinated with other officers to gather statements from witnesses and collect evidence, including the video footage from bystanders. She emphasized that the officer's actions were not acceptable and that the investigation would determine the full consequences. The judge remained nearby, observing quietly, ensuring that the focus remained on fairness and the proper handling of the incident. The crowd, now less tense, began to disperse slowly, still talking quietly about the events they had witnessed. As the evening grew darker, the judge finally returned to his car, preparing to leave the scene. He paused for a moment, reflecting on the events of the afternoon. Despite the shock and discomfort from being slapped, he felt a sense of satisfaction that the situation had been handled responsibly. He had maintained his dignity and calm, and the authorities were now in charge of ensuring accountability. The bystanders watched as he drove away, some waving quietly, others simply observing in respectful silence. The officer, now fully aware of the seriousness of the situation, faced the reality that his actions had consequences that could affect his career and reputation. The supervisor continued to oversee the process, ensuring that the investigation proceeded according to protocol. She emphasized the importance of accountability, fairness, and professionalism, setting an example for the officer and the community alike. The bystanders, having witnessed the events, began to discuss among themselves the lessons learned from the confrontation. In the days following the incident, the community reflected on what had happened. News of the event spread quickly, highlighting the officer's rash behavior and the judge's composed response. The video footage captured by bystanders played a significant role in demonstrating the officer's misconduct and the importance of accountability. The judge, though shaken by the encounter, continued his work, maintaining his focus on justice, fairness, and serving the community. His example inspired others to handle conflict with patience and respect. The officer faced internal disciplinary proceedings, with the evidence against him clear and undeniable. Realized that his actions had not only affected the judge, but had also shaken the trust of the community. The supervisor continued to manage the process professionally, ensuring that fairness was upheld and that the incident was addressed thoroughly. The judge's calm and composed behavior remained a powerful example, influencing the way the investigation was conducted and how the community perceived the events. The community, having witnessed the incident, began to discuss the broader lessons of the confrontation. People talked about the importance of treating every individual with dignity regardless of assumptions or bias. They reflected on how quickly anger and rash decisions could escalate a situation and how patience and calm could prevent harm. The judge's example became a topic of conversation, inspiring others to approach conflicts with composure and understanding. In the end, the incident served as a powerful reminder of the importance of fairness, accountability, and human dignity. The officer faced consequences for his rash actions. The supervisor ensured proper procedure. The judge's calm and composed behavior left a lasting impression on the community. The street, once the scene of tension and aggression, became a symbol of accountability and reflection, reminding everyone that even in moments of conflict, patience, respect, and fairness could guide actions toward a just outcome. The judge returned to his normal routine, carrying with him the experience of the confrontation but also the reassurance that he had handled the situation with integrity. The bystanders, who had witnessed the events firsthand, shared the lessons, with others spreading awareness about the importance of calm and respectful behavior. The officer's misconduct served as a cautionary tale, and the judge's composed response became an example of how dignity and patience could triumph over aggression. Through this incident, the community learned valuable lessons about the power of restraint, the importance of accountability, and the impact of bias and rash decisions. The judge's calm composure and dignified handling of the confrontation became a story that inspired many, highlighting the importance of fairness and respect in every interaction. The events on that quiet street, though shocking, ultimately served to reinforce the values of justice, human dignity, and the strength of remaining composed under pressure.